Hello. Today I'm going to be talking about some new JavaScript features that were added in version 1.19. There are three main features I'm going to talk about. One is the ability to update controls from the JavaScript. Another is a setup function that you can define that will be called once at the start of every scene. And the third is a new event system that allows you to run code conditionally based on the state of the inputs to your scene. So in order to show these new features, I have this very simple scene that allows you to define a gradient from left to right with these two color controls and has this darken slider that creates a vignetting effect. So if you've created scenes in Synesthesia, you might be familiar with this script.js file you can add to the scene folder. And in this file, you can define JavaScript code that will be run once per frame and can set uniforms for the shader. So one of the big new features that we've added to this JavaScript layer is the ability to update controls from within the JavaScript. So there are now 4 built-in functions in the JavaScript that you can see here. You can set a control. You can set a specific dimension of a multi-dimensional control, like an XY or a color. You can randomize a control, and you can default a control. So to show these functions, I'm going to create a few new scene controls so that these can be called conditionally based on those controls. So going to the scene JSON, I'm going to add a few bangs to start. Bang. We're going to call this one randomize colors. UI group, create a new group called script. That should be enough for a bang. Next, we're going to create another bang called default colors. And put it in the same group here. So now if I reload this scene, should see 2 new color or controls. Right now they're not going to do anything. If we now go to the script and say in our update function, which gets run every frame, you can say if inputs.randomize colors. That's how you can access the value of a control using this inputs object. Let's call this randomize control function. And we just need to pass in the name of the control. So that's going to be left color. And we'll add one for right color as well. So now if we refresh this and hit randomize colors, you'll see that those colors are randomized. Let's do another one for the default button. So inputs.default colors. And I'm just gonna copy these and change this to default. Randomize, default. So, you can randomize these individually using hotkeys. I'm pressing R and D here to randomize and default, but these functions give you a lot more control over specific subsets, and you can do, multiple at a time. It's a lot more fine-grained control versus these random and default buttons that affect the entire scene. One note here is that these strings that you put into the function that define the name of the control are fairly loose, so they're insensitive to case or spacing characters like the underscore, so I could do left color, right color. And that will still work here. So it's pretty flexible. Alright, so the next thing I'm going to show here is how you might use these top 2 functions to set a control to a specific value. This first one will set a control, and the second one will set a specific dimension of a control. So in order to show these, I'm going to create 2 new controls. These will be type toggle, and I'll set the default to 0 name will be darken LFO, and let's use the same UI group here. Gonna duplicate this and call this one cycle red. So now that these new controls are defined, we can just make sure, yep, they are appearing here. If you go back to script, I'm going to create a couple new conditions here to use this. So inputs.darken LFO greater than 0.5. Let's use this set control function. So I'm going to add in the name of this control, darken, and here you can pass in any value you want that's between 0 and 1. So I'm going to be using a sine function so that it will change over time according to that LFO shape. So you can use inputs.time here to get the time since the scene started, and since we want it between 0 and 1, I'm just going to normalize it by multiplying by 0.5 and adding 0.5. So now if we turn this on, turn on darken LFO, you'll see that that sine function is being mapped to the slider here. And what's nice about this is that you could map a sine wave to this variable in the GLSL, but that wouldn't allow you to then turn this off and set it to a specific value. So it just allows more flexibility of saying, you know, I want this to be automated, but I also want to be able to set it. So let's show another example of how you might use this with the set dimension control dimension function. So now we'll do cycle red. Yeah, that's what it was called. And this time we're going to be setting. Let's do left color. Left color. This time I want to use set control dimension. And since we're targeting the red channel, I'm going to put in 0 as the dimension index. So I could set, if this is 0, it's controlling the red. If it's 1, it's going to control the green. And if it's 2, it's going to control the blue channel. So I'm just going to use the same LFO that was used for darken. And you'll see that that is cycling just the red channel. It's a little hard to tell because that's, yeah, that makes it a little more clear between purple and blue. And you know, we can make this more interesting. Let's cycle the other one as well, and maybe make it twice as fast. Yeah, cycle red. Yeah, so you know, you can get some sort of interesting movement with that function. And the same goes, you would use the same function to determine the X or Y axis of an XY control. Alright, so the next new feature that was added in 1.19 is that you can now define a setup function. And rather than being called once per frame, this is just going to be called once at the start of the scene. So one thing this is useful for is initialization. I'm going to say random size is a new variable declared. And this is something I'm going to want to pass into the shader. So the way you do that is by adding a property to the uniform object. And in the setup, you know, if I were to use this right now, this would be uninitialized, so it wouldn't work properly. But in the setup function, we can set it to a specific value. And let's add in main, we can use this. Let's say 3 circle color. Times, I'm just creating a circle from the center. We're going to use length of UVC to get the center, and we'll use random size to determine at what point it gets cut off from the center. So I'm just going to add this in, final color plus equals circle color. Let's see if that worked. I'm going to clear this real quick. Yeah, so we've got this, and that variable was properly initialized. And one thing that's really nice about JavaScript in general is that these variables defined here will persist for the entire scene. So, something we could do is create another script control that will randomize that value in the script. So let's say randomize size. Script, bang, yep, looks good. Go back to the script, and let's add it here. If inputs.randomize size. Instead of using these built-in functions, we're just going to keep it simple and say random size equals math.random. Let's see what this between 0 and 1. Okay, I'm going to multiply this by 0.5 just to make it a little smaller, and that should do it. If I create this, now we have a random size, and yeah, this shows how you can keep this variable consistent and initialize it with setup. So the other thing that this setup function is good for is working with the other big new feature of 1.19 for JavaScript, which is that there's now a built-in event system. So you'll see I added this comment that lists the 5 other new built-in functions to JavaScript: on change, on off to on to off, while on, and while off. So they all have the same signature, which is target callback, and target is the name of an input variable that you want to track. These are all defining event handlers that will be called when this event type happens for the target. So just to make that a little more clear, let's use one of these. So I'm basically going to convert these conditionals to be event handlers. So if inputs.randomize colors, instead of doing it that way in the update function, let's say on, off to on. This is going to register an event to happen when the target goes from a value less than 0.5 to greater than 0.5. So I'm going to put the name of the input variable here, which is randomize colors, and then we put in the name of a callback. So I'm going to say on randomize colors here, and that string corresponds to the name of a JavaScript function. So I can define the function up here, and first, just to show that this is working, I'm going to use the built-in print function on, off to on, randomized colors, on randomized colors. So this is saying when the randomized colors inputs goes from less than 0.5 to greater than 0.5, call this function. So let's see if that happens. Yeah, so you'll see it gets printed in the console whenever randomized colors goes from off to on. So let's move this code, instead of being here, up in this function. And we'll get rid of this. So it's kind of an alternative to this sort of conditional code within update. and it also allows for some more complex logic. Something that's nice here is if randomized colors were a smooth bang, it would be greater than 0.5 for more than one frame. So that would mean that for every frame that it's greater than 0.5, these would be called. What you really want is to just call it once when it first crosses that threshold. So that's a useful feature of these event logics. So I'm going to get rid of this print function on randomized colors. Just confirm that this is still working. Yes. So I'm going to convert the rest of these as well. This is also going to be on, off to on, default colors, and on default colors. Copy this code up here, and we can get rid of this one. And these other ones are interesting because we're going to be using different event logic. Those would be while on, because we want this to happen for every frame that the darken LFO toggle is on. So let's try that with while on darken LFO, and we'll say on darken LFO. You know, those could be called whatever you want. Let's define that function on darken LFO and copy this code here. So now that code should be called while this is on and not called when it's off. So I've gone ahead and finished converting all the rest of the conditional if statements here to event handlers. And this gives you examples of these event type callbacks that happen once, and these while callbacks that happen while a condition is true. The last one that we haven't covered is on change. There's a lot of different ways you could use this, but one that I think is exciting is including presets into the scene, kind of hard-coded presets. I don't know why that's changing. So we're going to call on change here, and I'm going to say color palette. I'm going to create a new control called color palette, and on select color palette. So let's create that color palette control. Let's put this one in color. Actually, we'll keep it in script. So this is going to be a drop-down control. Color palette. And for drop-down controls, you need a couple extra keys. So one is going to be the labels key, and this is a list of labels. So let's do red cyan, blue gold, and green magenta. And the other thing you could add here is values and say, 0, 1, 2. But actually, if you don't need to set specific values, they will automatically be set to the index value. So I'm not going to worry about setting values here. This will already be 0, 1, 2. So now if I go back to script, let's just make sure that this control shows up properly. Yeah, we've got this. And I don't think we actually need underscores here, so might as well make that look a little bit nicer. I'm going to go back to script, and now I'm going to implement this function. Function on select color palette. And one thing that I haven't mentioned before is that these event callbacks, when they are called, they will have these two values as arguments, which is the current value of that input, whatever you mapped it to, and the previous value. So you can use those however you'd like. In these ones, I didn't really need to use the current value, but in this case, I would like to use it. So we can say if value equals 0, we're going to set it to red cyan. Else if value equals 1, that will be blue gold. And finally, if value equals 2, this could just be an else, but might as well be explicit. We'll set that to green, magenta. So what does this look like in here? We can just use the same set control function from earlier. So left color, we're going to be setting to red. This is an example of when we'd actually want to use these secondary optional values, which you can use to set multi-dimensional controls. So in this case, we're going to be setting left color to red, so that's going to be 1.0, 0.0, 0.0, and the right color is going to be cyan, so that is 1, 1. Let's check that that's working. So if I set this to red cyan, there you go. The reason why it didn't work the first time was because the value didn't actually change. So let's do the other ones. This one's going to be blue gold, so this will be 1. We'll just make this yellow, maybe a little bit less green in it, so it's more orangey. And let's do this final one, green, magenta, green, and 1 here. And if it's magenta, I'll make this a little bit less too. So now we should have 3 color palettes going here: blue, gold, red, cyan, green, magenta. So with this on change, you can build in hard-coded presets, and this can be nice in cases where you have sensitive variables that you also want to be able to control. So I thought of this as one example, this scene Gaussian smooth life. There's this whole advanced section where you can set the very specific fine-tuned parameters of the simulation, and based on the values here, you can get some very different looks of the simulation. So this would be an example where adding a drop-down where you can set these to specific values, but you're still allowing the user to change them and modify them. That sort of thing could be really useful. So thank you for watching this tutorial on the new JavaScript features. If you want to learn more about these features and JavaScript in general, be sure to check out our documentation on JavaScript scripting. I'll put a link in the description, but you can check out more about these functions and learn more about the event system with similar examples here. And yeah, if you are able to use these features and have any ideas about new JavaScript features or how these could be improved, we would love to hear that.